Hi everybody, this is Jeffrey here. Hopefully you can all hear me. There will be a little bit of a delay in the chat, so you may say something in the chat and then I won't get that message right away, or I'll answer your question a little bit delayed, but that's part of the glorious topic of mediation, which we're talking about today. And I'm here downtown, and I have a coffee from Noble Coffee, which I don't know if any of you know that place, but I live just about a block away from there. And I'm coughing a little bit because the coffee is extremely cold. And we'll just make sure everyone can hear me and stuff, and then we'll actually begin with some of the topics. So hopefully everything's working. You can give me a heads up in the chat if you can actually hear me okay, and if the video is functioning. Seems like everything's working from my end. Yeah, Angle says, hell yeah, Noble is the best. Avery Jackson says, hello. So it seems like everybody's here. And the quality here should be a lot better than Zoom. And if you want, you can probably go sit outside and watch this lecture and still chat. And oh yeah, my girlfriend Ella painted my nails yesterday. That was quite cool. And I've also been collecting some flowers. Hopefully you all have been having a nice time during your quarantine, and things have been going well. One of the things that I've been personally focused on is my TikTok channel and doing some drawing related things. And so I've been having some nice projects to do outside of working on school things. And now's a good time to, come up with some nice projects for yourself, I think. Of course, you shouldn't feel forced to do that, or you shouldn't feel pressure to do that, but it's a good time to do that, I think. All right. So one of the main things that I want to talk about, which we've been talking about so far in the class, is is this topic of mediation. And mediation is so this class is a theory and practice in EMDA, and EMDA is emerging media and digital art, right? So keyword being media. And media is a really interesting topic that you should definitely know about, regardless of whether you're going to be an artist or an art director or a business person. Media is actually an extremely important topic, and specifically the act of mediation. So the idea behind mediation is that mediation is the process by which you send a message, the process and means by which you get your message across. And this is pretty relevant to pretty much anything that you do creatively, because most of the things that Angle says, are we allowed to follow my TikTok? Yeah, you can follow my TikTok. I actually go live on TikTok every single night for an hour, and I do a kind of a kids show, so it's less topics like this, more goofy things. But anyway, so what I was saying is that you should pay attention to how you're getting your message across. And the thing is that most of the things that we think about as creative, so like creative things. Why don't we list a couple creative things? Let's hear some creative things from the chat. So like, what is some things that are creative? What are some creative activities that one can do? One thing is drawing. I like to drawing right now. What are some other creative things? What are some other creative things? There's making music. We're listening to some nice music right now. Sculpting is creative, yeah. What are some other creative things? Creative activities. Yeah, video editing. Anything else? That's probably good. That's a good set of ideas for us to work with, I think. So, if we think about these activities, drawing, making music, sculpting, and video editing, they all have to somehow relate with, they all have to somehow relate to communication in some way, right? The reason why you would make a drawing is so that you can communicate something, but there's a bigger, maybe you make a drawing and nobody ever sees it, right? Or maybe you make a song and nobody ever listens to it. It's just for yourself. Or you make a sculpture, nobody ever sees it or feels it. We make a video and it's just for practice, right? So it's not so much about communicating, it's actually a process of recording. And often what we think about as creativity relates to our ability to record things, especially today, basically. Sorry, I'm a bit short of breath. So, yeah, so creativity, basically, today, let's say, most of the things that we think of as being creative has to do with our ability to record stuff. How well can you record stuff, right? Doesn't mean that it's going to be shared yet or communicated, but your ability to determine if something was recorded well, right? Like if you make a drawing and only you ever see it, right? How do you determine the quality of that drawing, right? If you make a drawing but only you ever see it, how do you determine the quality? Well, you're basically communicating with yourself, right? So like if you look in the mirror and you grab your iPhone or whatever and you take a nice picture of yourself, something like that, you know, looking quite good in the mirror here. You take a selfie, right? Then you get a then it's quite easy to think, okay, I can that's a good selfie or a bad selfie, right? We all have a sort of inherent image of ourselves, and so if we take a picture of ourselves in the mirror, we can think, oh, that's a good quality selfie or a bad quality selfie, based on different criteria, right? Our mediation and recording, the same practice, is recording a form of mediation. Yes, yeah, exactly. That's sort of what I'm getting at, basically, is that when you record something, you're basically caught in what's called a feedback loop. Okay, you're caught in a feedback loop. So it's very easy to understand when you're literally looking in a mirror or literally looking at an image on a camera and you're just seeing yourself. You move your face around, you smile, you turn at different angles, right, in order to create a better recording, right? And in that process, you're in a feedback loop. You're actually you're in something called what they used to call a dialogue. You're in a dialogue, but the dialogue meaning you're in a kind of conversation, but you're in a conversation not between yourself and some other person. You're in a conversation between yourself and a recording. And so, as you're making a drawing, let's say we move from the photo selfie, to like a sketchbook page drawing. And we'll notate the sketchbook page drawing with a bit of a, sketchbook pages have a shadow underneath them. So you're doing a cool little drawing, right? You got this little drawing happening, and when you do that drawing, right, or if you're in painting class, right, let's say you're trying to paint a picture of a flower and stare at the flower, right? You're constantly, every mark that you make when you're trying to paint that flower, you're in a dialogue with the recording that you're making, right? So you also have the sort of the subject, right? So in this case, it's directly you or your face plus the mirror. In this case, there might be an actual flower somewhere that you're observing, something like that. And you're trying to look at the flower and draw the flower accurately, or try to get the mood of that flower down, or something like that. Now, when you're doing that, you're in a kind of a process in which you're constantly making decisions about the quality of that thing, and that process of making those decisions, right? Now, that is basically that is what we call taste, my friends. That is where this idea of artistic taste comes from. Now, you might say, like, well, you don't have to be creating stuff in order to have taste. That's true, but having taste means that you're able to determine what kinds of decisions were made and judge them based on certain criteria. So, like, if you're playing an indie game that came out and you're like, oh, they didn't add this feature, or the graphics aren't so good, or whatever, you're basically reviewing or criticizing the dialogue that took place between the creative person or the creative entity who was making the recording and you, who's on the other end, if that makes sense. So we have a little message about someone experiencing some lag. If you're experiencing lag, you can try to drop down the video quality. But from my end, I'm not dropping any frames. So in terms of my connection, things are quite good. And if there's video lag from my connection, the audio should still come through quite well. But if there is lag, then let me know, and you can try to drop down the video quality. All right, so any questions so far? We're slowly moving towards talking about this concept of mediation. I'll hang out a second and see if we have any questions from the class. And we'll just let that sink in for a bit. So, people have taste. Their taste is based on the dialogue that takes place between the creator of a thing and the recording. You might call it an artifact. In media theory, we might call them media objects. That's a fancy word for like content, basically. A media object is like, if you're reading media theory or like academic media theory type stuff, media object is basically what these days we call content. So your piece of content is basically the result of the dialogue that takes place between you and the media. Now, in order for taste to exist, another dialogue actually starts to take place, right? There becomes a dialogue that occurs between let's say the consumer or the audience. Let's zoom out a bit here. You have a relationship between the audience and the creative or the creator, and that's a different kind of dialogue that takes place. Now, that dialogue is also mediated, okay? It's also mediated. It's not just that media sort of is part of the equation when you're making something, right? Of course, you might be making a drawing and you're saying, yeah, I'm using this media, or the media is a drawing on paper or something like that, right? Mediation also takes place between the audience and the viewing of something, or the experiencing of something. For example, to get a little bit introspective, right now, you're watching this lecture on YouTube, and as an audience member, right, I'm drawing these drawings, and so I'm creating let's say the piece of content here, right? So I'm creating a piece of content, and you're consuming the content. And so right now, you might say that I myself am involved in creating the recording, and this recording involves me drawing. It also involves me not making but playing a piece of music which you're listening to. I have not done any sculpting, but we could get into that if we want to. I mean, I do have some Play-Doh, so if anyone's down, we can get down with the haptic arts. Haptic meaning related to touch in the hands. And also I'm doing some video editing here, right? So of course I can do a bit of live video editing or, whatever, things like that. So all these activities are actually going on right now simultaneously in order to actually produce this recording. And when I determine to draw or to, raise the volume of the music or lower the volume, right? I'm basically looking at the reflection, right? I'm looking at the thing that's being made, and I'm conversing with it. I'm saying, "Oh, no, you're too loud. You're too loud. I have to turn you down," right? Or I'm listening to my voice in my headphones, and I'm saying, "Oh, no, there's not enough reverb on my voice. Things have to be a little bit different." Yeah. But you get the idea, right? I mean, you get the gist of this idea. So that's my relationship with this exact recording that you're listening to right now. Now, the audience relationship to the creative is mediated by a few different things. First of all, it's mediated by the piece of content. So we have to think about the fact that in order for you to talk to me right now, first you have to go through the content that I'm creating. You got to go through the image, right? And then you can chat with me. But the image isn't the only thing you have to go through, okay? You also have to go through some other stuff. You have to go through the network. But on top of the network, we have in this case, we'll use a generic term for it. We have a privatized platform, right? We have a software we have some resources that allow the content to travel through the network. Bennett Strickler says, "Taste is relative. Whatever you might think is tasteless is in another audience member's mind in good taste." Yeah, that's an amazing, that's why I brought up taste, because, excuse me, my cold brew coughs. That's why I brought up taste, because the next topic that I'm going to talk about today is objectivity and subjectivity. So often you might be in a kind of an art critique or something like that, and someone will say, it's all relative. You might think what I like isn't what you like, and therefore art is totally subjective. And I'm going to prove that wrong today. I'm going to tell you that is actually not the way that art works, because there has to be consensus about what art is in order for there to even be taste. So I'll take you through using a sort of a test art form that I've designed. I'll take you through that theory of taste, and that should be kind of an interesting sort of second half of the lecture. I think that will be the big takeaway for today. So there's different processes so basically we can put up here, let me grab a big red marker so we can kind of understand this little improvised diagram. This is a map of mediation. Right? So mediation, which is basically the way something gets communicated and sort of received, occurs, between me and the recording. It also occurs between you and me, but before it can get between you and me, it also has to be mediated, or has to be in dialogue with the network, right? With the platform of somehow. And so there's all these different aspects there that can change the message, right? For example, video quality. Your network connection might change the quality of the content. It might compress the content in some way, in a way that I didn't necessarily intend. But I have to know about those things in order to make sure my message gets through, right? For example, I have to make sure my text is big enough for the resolution, right? I have to make sure that you can actually read these words and hear my voice and things, even if your quality bumps down. So mediation is very important no matter to think about, and it's important to understand some media theory regardless of where you sit in this graph professionally, okay? So like, if you graduate from SOU, graduate from school, and you become like an IT person who's working on YouTube servers and things like that, then you're still primarily involved in a media process, right? And if you're going to be a content creator, then you have to understand the structure. And if you're going to be a professional audience member, what's a professional audience member? Basically a critic, right? If you're going to be a professional audience member, and many creatives today, like many YouTubers who here watches like YouTube reviews of video games or products or YouTube reviews of different kinds of things. So if you're going to be a professional critic of some kind, then you also have to understand this whole graph. Because yes, you may have judgments about things or you may have taste, but you have to also understand where that taste comes from if you really want your audience to actually basically believe you, or to feel that you're telling the truth. Otherwise, you're just saying things like, oh, I don't like that, so it's bad. You have to go a little bit deeper into this graph to understand where your opinions come from. All right. So let's move on to the next topic, which is pretty cool. The topic of objectivity/subjectivity in art. Any questions while I set up for this next slide? Perhaps I will show you guys my little Roblox people. Hey. They can hold hands too, like this. They're Roblox dancers. I actually should take them off. It's time to dismantle this contraption that I made. And the primary thing that you're looking at here is this little notebook that I use all the time. And I've used this notebook to develop a test art form, a sort of a toy art form. So different art forms that exist that people might have taste about are like video games, right? Or movies, or sculpture, or paintings. And these different art forms have different rules, right? So for example, the art form that I've been sort of developing as a hobby is called whistlegraphs. And an example of a whistlegraph is something like this. Would you like to come down the stairs?
I don't want to, 'cause I'm too scared.
Woo! So it's a little drawing that goes with some music, right? So we could say this is example A, right? So that's one piece of content, right? That's one piece of content that was created within this art form. So never mind the rules about the art form. Let's look at another example. Example B. So example B would be something like, hey there, Apple. Hey there, Apple. Are you okay? Did you fall from the tree yesterday? Right, so that's example B. That one was actually made with my friend Alex, who's here, I think, listening in on the lecture right now. And we'll do one more. We have a little request. So one more is the robots. And that goes like this. Across the way, the robots stay in the same position, bound by a signal. Okay, so we have three examples of my toy, three pieces of content that exist within my little toy art form. And now that we have three examples, you can probably guess a little bit about like what this art form is, right? So the idea is that it's pretty easy. You basically draw, and there's some lyrics and some music that goes with the drawing, and the drawing has to be done in the same order every time. So for example, if I do A a couple more times, would you like to come down the stairs?
I don't want to because I'm too scared.
Right? So you can see it's done in the exact same way each time. We call that A1. So here's an example of my my toy art form, an art form that allows us to understand certain aspects of media and mediation more clearly, because the art form itself is very simple. You know, you basically have lines that you draw, and those are drawn in a certain order, and that makes up the composition, and then there can be lyrics involved and things like that. Yeah. Now, a few things here. The way that these things are being drawn, the way that the sort of, let's say the style, right? So if I want to do, the style in which I'm drawing these is so that you can very clearly understand sort of what the rules are, like how you would redraw them, right? But just like jazz, you know, I could adjust the style. So I could do something like, would you like to come down the stairs?
I don't want to because I'm too scared.
Right, so you have something drawn a little bit of a different style, but that's still that piece of content. It's just been, it has something sort of on top of it, right? The person who draws this understands the original piece, but they're adding their own thing to it. So another example would be something like this.
Hey there, Apple. Are you okay? Did you fall from the tree yesterday?
Right, so, you know, and if you use a big Indian ink brush or something like that, then you could, you know, the idea is that these can have different stylizations, right? So just like a song can have different players, right? Different players might play the song differently, and you might see different results, and that becomes part of the content that they're creating, or that version of the thing. Now, this is partially where taste comes into play, because if you have different people drawing things in different ways, you might say, oh, I like the really simple way of drawing whistlegraphs because I like to learn them. Or you might say, oh, I already know all the whistlegraphs. Learning them is quite easy. I like the more advanced ones, right? And so here you get into the idea of like what some people would call elitism, cultural elitism, or, you know, basically taste, right? At a certain point, you don't like the simple stuff. You like the more complicated stuff, the stuff that goes over the simple stuff, the stuff that outlines the simple stuff. Does that sort of make sense? As one sort of as one idea of sort of how an art form can grow in complexity. And then we're going to move on also to the idea of objectivity and subjectivity, which is a pretty fun topic. So we'll hit on that for a second. Now, examples in this test art form, right? So example A here, right? If I were to draw that again here, I would say, would you like to come down the stairs?
I don't want to because I'm too scared.
So that's our sort of first example. Now, what if I were to not actually know the rules? Like, let's say I want to play a song on the piano, but I don't even have the song memorized. I don't even know it. So let's say I do something like this. Would the stairs like over in the top to go woo woo, right? So let's say I don't even understand the piece at all. Like, I'm trying to remember it, right? So here you have let's say you might say that this is a success, right? A valid, you know, it's correct, right? This would be right. And this would be wrong. This would be right, and this would be wrong, right? So this would be correct, 0 errors. This would be a failure, right? This would be a failure. Does that make sense? Now, in between that, you have something. You have style, and you also have abstraction. So an example of style we've already seen. An example of abstraction would be maybe close to wrong, but not actually wrong. So here's an example of abstraction. Would you like to come down the stairs? I don't want to 'cause I'm too scared. Right? So I've done all the marks, but I haven't done them spatially in the right way, right? And so this is an example of basically what early abstraction modern painting was, right? Rather than looking at a flower and trying to do it in the complete right way, they look at the flower and they change the spatial arrangement of the marks. And this is, what's commonly known as cubism, but that was more of a style of doing it. The big topic here is abstraction. It's saying, well, I'm still doing a lot of things right, and you can still get the general vibes of the thing, but it's not so wrong that it isn't the thing at all, right? So for example, if you were trying to make a painting and you stacked up a couple rocks and then just left them outside, people might not even know that a human did that, right? They might not even know it was a creative thing. So the message doesn't even get sent across, right? It's completely wrong. However, if I were to stack up some rocks that looked a little bit like this, and somebody knew the version of this, it would be abstracted from the right version. It would be partially correct, right? So this topic is basically you might say this is a little bit about representation, how we represent things. Right, representation, or you might say realism or something like that in art. But the real takeaway here has to do with objectivity and subjectivity, right, and taste. So objectivity relates to how right you are, right? So if you objectivity relates to how close did you get to the subject, right? So if I do this whistlegraph here, you could say scientifically, basically, would you like to come down the stairs? I don't want to 'cause I'm too scared. Right? You say that's correct, right? Nobody can say that that's not correct, right? But when it comes to abstraction, that's where you have to get a little bit more subjective. That's where people start to disagree. Some people will say, yeah, that is a really cool, hey Jeffrey, that's a really cool whistlegraph. And other people will say, that's not a whistlegraph at all. It should, the spatial arrangement of the marks should be different, right? And so you get these ideas of subjectivity in art when things are partially not correct. You know what I mean? And that's basically based on consensus of people. How close something is to the ideal version, or whether something is abstracted or not. And so you have these arguments hashed out in paintings. So for a long time it was do the paintings look like does this abstract painting of a flower look like a flower or not? That was a big argument, Now these days, a lot of those arguments are over, but you might have an argument about is that even a painting or not? And some people would have taste saying so often I've said that as long as you have a frame of some kind and you put things in it on a plane of some kind, then I would consider that a picture or a painting. And that's a form of taste related to what I think consists, what I think a painting is, right? So a lot of times I've talked about a concept called digital painting, and digital painting meaning a painting made of pure information. But some people would say that the term digital painting shouldn't even exist. You shouldn't even be able to say something can be a digital painting, because their taste is such that they think anything that is a painting needs to actually have real paint involved. So they would say, oh, it's a digital image or a digital picture, but they wouldn't say it's a digital painting. Now the reason why I I would disagree, and this is because of my taste here, is I would say that painting has more to do with gestures and how things are put down as opposed to the material that it consists of. And so that's where the arguments come from in taste and in art. Does that kind of make sense? And those arguments happen all over the place. That's where arguments come from, like, oh, that's not a movie, that's a Netflix show, right? That's an interesting argument, right? That's similar to the digital painting argument, saying like, you know, that's not a movie, that's a Netflix show, or that's not a movie, that's a film, right? Think about these 4 terms, right? Film, movie, show, and video. And what's the difference? Like, what do you think of? Like, when I think of film, I think of like Tarkovsky, the great Russian director who directed one of my favorite movies, Solaris. When I think of movie, I think of Toy Story. Toy Story. Also a great work, one of my favorite things. When I think of show, I think of Walking Dead. Walking Dead is a good show. Man, that's a good show. But it's very different from a Tarkovsky film. And when I think of video, I think of a Video Game Donkey, who's one of my favorite YouTubers who would make what I call a video. Now here's the thing. You can watch all of these things as what? As a .mp4 file using H.264 encoding, right? The way you would watch a Tarkovsky film right now is you would go online, you would get the film as a .mp4 file with H.264 encoding, which is exactly the encoding that you're watching this very video here with right now. That's how you would watch a Tarkovsky film. The way you would watch the Toy Story movie is you would, I don't know, grab Disney Plus or whatever, and you would also get that video file. Or you get that, we can't even call it a video file. What do we call it? I mean, in the industry they call it video, but artistically, we think of different things when we think of these things. If you want to watch the show, you head over to, what is it, TMC or whatever it's called. Or I forget is that the channel? Yeah, TMC or whatever it is that plays Walking Dead. You stream the show as an MP4. If you want to watch Video Game Donkey, you go to YouTube, you get the MP4, right? So this is very interesting, right? Because the way that we use these terms collectively, right, and our opinions about them determines we might say the collective taste. The collective taste of our culture. Right? Now, to be unaware of the fact that we have these 4 terms for essentially what is the exact same material, right, I think is a tragedy, right? To be unaware that that this is what's really happening, right? And that this stuff is the stuff of taste and the stuff of art, and you can have arguments about these things, right? That really puts you at a disadvantage. And so one of the main things that learning about media and mediation will help you to do is it will help you to be aware that of what's called the affordances of your media. Affordances. Has anybody used that term before or heard that term? Affordances. Oh, AMC. Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, American Movie Channel or whatever. So the affordance of a media, right, is like, let's use a coffee cup for example. So the affordance of this noble coffee cup is that I can take the lid off, I can suck from the straw, I can contain coffee. It is compostable, and it also affords the ability for the coffee company to put an image on the side right? Or to put an image on the outside. So the fact that the image is on the outside isn't the affordance. The affordance is the quality that the cup has to allow an image to be printed on it. Does that make sense? So that's what the affordance is. The affordance is the quality something has, its capacity to do something, its sort of behavioral capacity. Now, interestingly enough, video, the reason why we think about these things as different is because they come from different times, right? Film comes from an older material, right? Those sort of film reels. And film had a different affordance. It had a different set of capacities or material capacities than MP4 file does. So when we look at films, we see a conversation between the creator of the film and the recording where very different decisions were taking place and different tastes were developed because the material was different. Now today, what I think we need in terms of this material is we need to start having more awareness about this material, and we need to start actually thinking about this as the thing, and we need to develop our idea of what are the affordances of a .mp4 file with H.264 encoding, not what the affordances are here. Because when you say film, movie, show, or video, you're thinking of the affordances of yesterday. You're basically retro thinking. Your thinking is retrograde. So if you want to have contemporary ideas and you want to be up to date, you always want to be up to date on the material. What is the current content actually being made with, So content is the key. What is actually the media or the material that is delivering the content to you? And so, for example, right now, I'm drawing on paper, and that's part of it. But what I'm really doing right now is I'm making a video, right? And to not be aware of that is, I think, just really puts you at a disadvantage. Because if you don't know what all the capabilities are, then you're only going to be doing a subset of them, right? You're not going to be able to do, you're not going to be thinking that you might want to do spinny things like this, right? If you're just thinking about a notebook and you're not thinking about, sort of what's possible in between the notebook and the video and the network and things, then you're going to miss out on some cool options, For example, I can do some color changing things here. Right? Now that doesn't mean that you have to go all in on special effects or whatever. It just means that there's places along the chain, there's sort of places along the delivery path from you producing your video file to it getting to other people in which you can creatively do things. And those are the affordances. Just like how if you run a coffee shop and you don't put your logo on the side of the cup because you're not aware that the cup can have a logo printed on it, then you're at a disadvantage. And that's a business disadvantage, but I'm talking about creative and artistic disadvantages and why it's important to be up to date. All right. Well, I'm not going to keep you all for much longer. I think that it's probably time for me to calm down and stop drinking my cold brew. So, are there any questions? We'll have a few minutes now for questions. And those of you who don't have questions, you're welcome to leave. Class is adjourned. And this video, of course, will be recorded, so you can always come back and watch it, including the chat, so you'll be able to watch the chat. So, any questions before we break off? What are some questions? Or maybe things that I forgot to cover? Perhaps we have no questions. You think this is a good form for a lecture? Thanks, Zane. Yeah, I thought this would be better than Zoom. Quality's better, bit of a better vibe. Do we have any assignments or anything I'd like to think about until next term? Well, obviously, I would like you to think about these things until next term. And there's there's no assignment for today, but what I would like you to do is think about some of these ideas, and what I would really like to do is to actually talk about them. So I would like you to really, really think about, like, what is it, like, when you go home, like when you stop doing this, I don't know. I mean, right now you're watching an MP4 file, but like how much of your day right now is spent literally engaging with this compression algorithm, right? And who made that? And how does that determine the meaning, right? Because, you have your creative person and they're making their content, but right now we're all stuck in a situation where that content is being passed over the network. And so I would like you to actually really think about, maybe make some notes about how this is actually changing the meaning of things, okay? And one of the most important topics about mediation is, of course, distance, right? If we were not, if we were all one omnipresence, for example, if I was not separate from you and you were not separate from me, there would be no need for mediation. But because we're separate entities and we have to discuss things or use language or make videos, then we have to mediate our experience. And so I would like you to think about mediation as it relates to a few other more, let's say, humanistic topics like understanding. Like, to what degree is your ability to understand somebody else related to the media that is being used? And also I'd like you to think about compassion, which is related to understanding. And I would like you to think about emotions, like anger, or happiness. And start to consider this idea of the distance that things have to travel across time and space. How far does your message have to go, and what does it mean on the other side? And how that relates to what we might call the effects of mediation. The effects. These are some possibilities. These are some possible effects of this lecture, right? Someone here might be angry because somewhere along the chain, the network may have their network connection might be poor, and they're getting frustrated and angry because they can't hear me. Somebody else with a strong connection might be very happy, right? Some of you may understand me or not, depending on if you can read my handwriting, right? Or if you understand English. So think about all the layers of mediation that have to occur here, and where things can go wrong, and how different emotions can occur depending on where things go right or wrong. Okay, that's the end for today, and I'm going to adjourn the lecture, and I'll be on Discord till the end of the period for those of you who have questions. If you haven't finished your utopian machine diagram, then please submit it by the end of the day today. Goodbye. Goodbye. Whoops.